There are a number of theories as to why this obelisk is here. The most popular is that it commemorates a horse called Woodcock who used to pull a stagecoach and collapsed on a hill not far from here. And that road, actually, the bend in the road is still called Woodcock Corner. Another theory is that there used to be a house here and it collapsed down an old tin mine. But the owner of the house grasped onto the mantelpiece and he was saved. And in order to commemorate his miraculous survival, he built this. Personally, I suspect that it's just a garden ornament from when this used to all be just like the garden and lawns of a big posh house that used to be just up the hill in the 18th century. But this shows the issue that I want to talk about today, which is about, memory and people forgetting things. So, what is time immemorial?
Well, to cut to the chase, it's any date before 6th of July 1189. But how did we get there? It's all down to King Edward I. Like a number of monarchs, he was trying to establish a common law. In other words, a legal system that was the same across the entire realm. Because in practice, the barons operated a series of fiefdoms, and they pretty much ran their own legal systems in their own territories. But he wanted to reform that. One of his reforms was to do with land ownership and rights about land. We mentioned before that the Statute of Frauds later on introduced the idea that any interest in real property, that is to say land, whether you own it or you have a right to do something, like a right of way or a right to collect firewood, has to be in writing. But prior to that, you had to prove your rights by showing you'd had those rights since the date of the Norman conquest. And by 1275, that was going to be a bit of a headache. So what Edward said was, right, okay, we'll start the clock running again. Basically, you only have to show your rights from the reign of Richard III. And that's where we get the 6th of July 1189 date from. That worked for a while, and by a while I mean 600 years. But by 1832, people were commenting that it was actually a bit of a hardship just to show ownership back to 1189. So, something called the Prescriptions Act 1832 introduced the idea that time immemorial, in other words, look, you've been doing this or you've had this right for as long as anybody can remember. We'll call it 20 years. Or 30 years when it comes to crown lands. So that's the idea now, that if you can show a right and it's been established for at least 20 years, then that right is there. Sometimes we introduce what we call legal fictions, which are ways of addressing problems, because like I say, under the 1677 Statute of Frauds, you have to show an interest in land, it has to be in writing. So say, for instance, you've got a right of access across somebody's land, whether it's to drive your vehicle or to lay utilities or to go on there to collect firewood or something like that. We have this idea of the doctrine of the lost modern grant. In other words, we pretend, even though we know it's not real, that actually somebody did give you these rights on a piece of paper, but it's been lost. But we'll work on the assumption that it's always been there. So that's the idea. I mean, you've probably heard of these things like that, they're called easements, effectively. And 20 years is the usual sort of cut-off point. That doesn't actually have to be you, by the way. Say, for instance, you buy a house and it's a shared driveway or you've got access to something like that. So long as the person who had that property before you had clocked up a number of years, you can claim that. So if they've been driving across somebody's land for 17 years and you carry on doing it for another 3 years, then that right is deemed to exist as if you've always had that right. So there you go. So yeah, time immemorial, 6th of July, 1189, but really any time more than 20 years ago now. So, hope you found that, as always, vaguely interesting, possibly even vaguely useful. If you did, please consider clicking the like buttons, subscribing, sharing, and all that sort of thing. But like I say, you're under no obligation to, because I just enjoy rambling.